Welcome back to Seeking the Truth about the Sword of Truth. My name is Tom, and I'll be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 16 of Wizard's First Rule. In our last episode, Richard and Kahlan spend the night together on an island surrounded by snakes before they spend the night together in an inn filled with criminals and want-to-be rapists. Please note these episodes contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but for future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read the series yet and you intend to, I'd encourage you to read the books first and come back to them later and see what I think about them. Spoiler alert, the more I look at these characters, the more I'm able to see myself. At the beginning of this chapter, best estimates place the time since the beginning of Wizard's First Rule on the morning of the 8th day. There are an estimated number of 197 apples left in Richard's backpack, and the estimated number of people killed by Richard's hand is 1. We begin the chapter as Bill tells Richard about some trouble which has broken out downstairs as two men, matching the description of a quad, came inside and started wrecking up the place, looking for a woman matching Kahlan's description. It's time to spend some time talking about what the quads mean and why they are used to hunt confessors. Here is why there are 4 members of a quad and why 4 of them are sent to kill a confessor. Symbolically, the main characters represent the virtues of objectivism. Kahlan is the sense of justice and her desire for it. It is well known that in the Sword of Truth series, Terry Goodkind took inspiration from the philosophy of objectivism. So regardless of personal feelings or opinions about objectivism in general, having a thorough understanding of those ideas is essential to understanding the author's point of view. Since this understanding is only hypothetical, and the rational mind is able to decide what it chooses to believe and not believe, there isn't any harm in entertaining such an exercise. Right? There have been entire books written about objectivism, and what I'll be sharing here is just a fraction of the information to be found on the subject. But to keep things simple, I'll stick to the very basics. A good place to start asking questions is, what is objectivism? It's impossible to understand a thing without knowing what it is, right? While my college degree is in physics, I did pursue a dual major with a focus on humanities, which is a study of literature, history, and philosophy. The reasoning behind that choice was simple. The humanities courses were by far the most useful when it came to understanding personal growth and education. The fastest way to learn is find the best ideas other people have had and start with those. Philosophy in general is a collection of some of the best ideas we have had as a species regarding what it means to be human. The physics degree was so I could be employable in a field that wasn't teaching humanities. So while I dive into a crash course on some of what some of this means, please know it isn't a case of the blind leading the curious. I've had some background and experience in this, a formal education on the topic, and a pursuit of this topic well beyond my university career. Objectivism is a type of philosophy. It's a collection of thoughts, observations, and ideas meant to explain what it means to be human, what our purpose is, and how do we lead lives which are good for us and, by extension, those around us. So don't worry about understanding all of what objectivism wants. All you need to understand to know what objectivism is ask yourself if you've ever heard about Aristotle, Plato, Nietzsche, Kant, Adams, Voltaire, Epicurus, John Stuart Mill, Pascal, Diogenes, personal favorite of mine, Scotus, not to be confused with Scrotus Testicles, Descartes, and so on. All of these people had the same thing in common with the author's references to objectivism. He felt that objectivism had some ideas on what it meant to be alive, and he put those ideas together in an attempt to help themselves and others learn more about what it means to be human. All of these philosophers have core ideas they use to bind their ideas. There's fancy words and enough terms to make your head spin, but for this exercise, none of those other things matter as far as understanding what Goodkind is referencing when he writes the Sword of Truth series. That's a 2-minute primer on what philosophy is in general and why it's useful. So now on to the specific philosophy of objectivism. Objectivism is built on something called the pillars of objectivism. That is, 4 ideas which are meant to work together to create a healthy life. And it starts when one of these pillars is removed or ignored. And that is when the rest of the life suffers. So that means that there's just 4 things to worry about, which isn't too bad because there are 4 members of the quad. So really it's only one thing to remember for each member of the quad. Those pillars are the foundation of all objectivism. So naturally, entire books have been written about them as well. But it doesn't take a college graduate or even a high school graduate to get enough information to understand what the author is talking about when he uses the quad as a symbol for how our sense of justice can be destroyed, along with our ability to tell right from wrong when we lose that. The four ideas of objectivism are reality, reason, individualism, and laissez-faire capitalism. We've spent a lot of time talking about reason, so that one shouldn't be too much of a stretch. The ability to look at a fact or situation from all sides and use that information to reach a logical conclusion, even if that conclusion goes against something which feels different or feels like a contradiction. Individualism is what makes us who we are, and also that which makes it okay for us to hold ideas and opinions which belong to us for the reasons we choose. That is to say, we have ownership of our own life and our choices. We spent a lot of time on that one too, so there's no problems there. The third one is reality. This one isn't bad either, and thankfully Goodkind tied up the explanation to this in something we are already familiar with. The wizard's sixth rule. What exists, exists. What is, and from this irreducible bedrock principle, all knowledge is built. It is the foundation from which life is embraced. While the wizard's sixth rule is talking about reason, it needs to tell us what it means when reason interacts with something and how we can know our reason is going to be useful. What exists, exists. What is. This irreducible bedrock principle builds all knowledge. That is what the author is saying. A thing is a thing, and that is enough to build something that can tell us what it means to be alive. It's just a fancy way of saying the way things are. A chair made out of oak is a chair made out of oak. The chair doesn't need our permission, knowledge, or understanding to be made out of oak or to be a chair. We can think it's a table made of birch. We can write papers and give sermons on why that chair isn't a chair or made of oak. But nothing in the universe has the power to change that. Star Trek The Next Generation explored this idea in the episode Chain of Command. Captain Picard is captured during a covert mission and is tortured by Gul Mardred to give up valuable information a Starfleet captain would have. In a scene that pays homage to the novel 1984, Madred challenges Picard's perception with coercion. He shows him 4 bright lights and tells him the torture will stop if he says there are 5 lights instead. Picard is rescued in time before giving away any information, but he privately admits to Deanna Troi that he was saved just in time, and that at the point they rescued him, he was broken enough to say or do anything to make that torture stop. The most important part of this is at the very end when he says he actually believed he could see 5 lights. The point of the episode is that a person's will can be twisted, turned, and broken so much that reality is no longer within their grasp. All this idea of objectivism is saying is that everything in the universe doesn't depend on anything else to tell it what it is. Things are what they are, and it's our job to find out if we plan to interact with those, what they mean, and all of that is dependent on reason, which is dependent on looking at things from multiple points of view, because that's just the way things are. That is what is meant by the wizard's 9th rule. To believe in a contradiction is to abdicate your belief in the existence of the world around you and the nature of the things in it. To instead embrace any random impulse that strikes your fancy. To imagine something is real simply because you wish it were. A thing is what it is. It is itself. There can be no contradictions. There are 4 lights. No amount of torture can change that, and Picard thinking there are 5 lights after conditioning via pain and torture doesn't mean a thing, which, spoiler alert, is why I spend so much time talking about how we feel about things not being a good way to decide what is good or bad for us. The wizard's 6th rule is the only reliable way to make good decisions all the time. I'll be the first person to admit that the last pillar of objectivism has a name which does not readily tell a person with no background in philosophy or economics what it means. The pillar of laissez-faire capitalism. It doesn't mean that the idea isn't good or accurate. It just is. It's just not as accessible as the other 3, which is why I'm going to keep all of the same thoughts and ideas and motivations of the idea and just rebrand it into something which makes more sense to those without a formal background in philosophy. Forget about capitalism because it's not only talking about it's not talking about the good exchange of services without government involvement, which is the simplest definition of laissez-faire capitalism. Let's replace it with something we are very familiar with in the series. It still means the same thing as it does in all the textbooks, but the word capitalism objectivism invites a person to think that it applies only to money and business, and that simply isn't true, nor is it the intent or the idea when objectivism explains it. So the fourth idea of objectivism is the wizard's 13th rule, specifically the part you hear me quote so often. We cannot change the nature of humanity by force, violence, or imprisonment, which in objectivism would be best described as mutual consent. If you think the best arrangement between two people is when two people get together and agree on anything, and that so long as no one else's consent is being violated, then those two people are the only people which matter in that agreement. While it might seem tricky at first, all you have to do is ask yourself if any of the following things make sense. Things we do all the time, like getting cell phone contracts, trading farm fresh eggs for fixing a farmer's fence, agreeing to pick the kids up at 7 while the other person makes dinner, agreeing to work a set number of hours at a set wage, and receiving that wage as promised at the end of the work week. Those are all examples of mutual consent. Mutual consent can be violated, and many of our existing laws are built around this. Rape is illegal, and so is taking someone else's property without their permission. A contract which is broken can result in legal action against the person who failed to keep their word. It tries to protect the person who did keep their word. So let's all tie this together with the quads now. They're representative of attacks against the 4 pillars of objectivism, attempting to destroy a person's sense of justice, which acts to protect their integrity, which is Richard. Attacks are made against reality, reason, individualism, and mutual consent. The confessor's power represents justice's ability to take one of these 4 ideas and use it to defend against attacks made by the other 3. It's not something which can stand when one of the main supports is destroyed, though. Only one of the 4 pillars needs to be knocked down. Either all 4 ideas work together or they don't. It only takes one of these to being destroyed to destroy a person's sense of justice. A desire to do good kills a sense of justice when they ignore reality and see that what they are thinking is good really is just making them feel good. A desire to get our sense of self-worth from others agreeing with us and saying we are good instead of using logic and reason to tell us we are good. Needing another person to magically make being good okay for us is what destroys justice. Finally, ignoring that no matter how hard we try, there's no substitute for asking someone to agree with us of their own free will, that is a destruction of justice. Without justice, integrity has no value. When justice is destroyed, subverted, corrupted, our mind becomes like Richard when he is separated from Kahlan, becomes lost and heartbroken. Only the strongest can survive this type of attack on the strength of their justice alone. It takes a village of other virtues to protect an attack from that many sides. And I've named a few of those virtues already in characters which we've been introduced to. And I'll be introducing more virtues as more characters are introduced later. If you've ever wondered why 4 men are sent to kill a quad, if you're wondering why 4 men in a quad are sent to kill a confessor, whether you agree with objectivism or not, given the author's belief in objectivism, it's safe to say that he is making this argument and using the 4 ideas of objectivism to build everything else he thinks is important for us to be able to lead good and happy lives. Richard and Kahlan both realized that the wizard trouble Zed sent to take care of the quad wasn't enough to get the job done. Bill tells them that one of them was torn up pretty good, his arm was in a sling, and he had big cuts, which didn't seem to bother him too much. Back in Chapter 7, Zed stopped a Gar from attacking him when he used his wizardly intimidation powers to get it and go kill the quad, which was hunting the Mother Confessor. And symbolically, Zed's interaction with the Gar was representative of turning away an argument or a verbal attack without being drawn into it. If I'm using the language of cognitive dissonance, something I've discussed many times, to revisit what that means, all I'm saying is that there is a choice a person has, whether they're going to fight back when provoked or challenged. And often, all it takes is a simple but powerful act of not legitimizing an aggressive person's opinion by choosing to not engage with it at all. The choice to disagree with someone and say you simply don't care what they think about you is there. Or that you're trying to fight about what you want to fight about. Walking away is a powerful, powerful thing, and here's why. Remember from previous chapters what the meaning behind the unwritten wizard's rule is. It's that knowledge can can only be earned, it can't be given. And the wizard's 8th rule is deserve victory. Despite all of his accomplishments, it took Richard nearly the entire Sword of Truth series to figure out that no one can give him the justification or validation he needs to believe he is right in his decisions. That decision can only come from within. It takes Richard so long to figure this out because it's one of the most difficult things for anyone to figure out. Most of us lead lives built on the agreement and validation of others. We're taught from a young age that our ideas only matter if enough people tell us they matter. And far too often, we're told that the ideas we don't think are right make us bad, selfish people. And even though the people making such claims have no problem treating anyone who disagrees with them like they don't matter as a human being, they only matter as someone who agrees with what they think is right. Just because that's what's around us doesn't mean it's right, and doesn't mean it's impossible to get out of. It's just difficult sometimes. But once a person does, they're still bound by the wizard's 12th rule, which means even if they figure it out, that doesn't mean they can make anyone else see what they have. And according to the wizard's 13th rule, they certainly can't convince them of that by force. But they are acting from a place which needs to be fed the validation of others. In a way, you become their emotional food source. It's what Chase meant early on when he asked Richard how to get rid of the wolves. It's possible to go out and hunt them, but it's also dangerous and a lot of work. It's much safer and easier to take away their food supply and let them starve on their own. Engagement of their position, either to agree or to disagree, is what gives them strength. You make them stronger by interacting, whether you agree with them or not. And that's the lesson here. Once that food supply is cut off, the predators of consent weaken, starve, and retreat. The best way to see if you understand this concept is ask yourself if you've ever seen someone start to get very upset when someone wasn't paying attention to them. They become agitated, angry, belligerent in an attempt to force that engagement they feel entitled to. Or another way to understand this is ask if you've ever seen someone who wasn't being responded to online post comment after comment of increasingly angry and emotional language, even though no one was responding back to them at all. The person who is doing this has already committed a form of violence against their consent by placing their desire to pick a fight and argue with someone above the desire of someone who wants nothing to do with them at all. The only difference between someone who is getting bullied and them getting increasingly upset that the person they're trying to talk to won't be forced to argue back is all of the hate and anger that was meant for the other person is being directed back at the person who gave it out in the first place. They have to feel what they tried to make someone else feel when you do not engage. And that's why they get upset. It's a type of cognitive reflection. If you were compare it to a style of martial arts, it would closely resemble Aikido. There's no violence created against the attacker, only a redirection of their own force back upon themselves. They're only hurt as much as they tried to hurt another person. After a few exchanges, the wisdom of stop hitting yourself usually sinks in and they will leave frightened, confused, disoriented, possibly angry, in search of easier and weaker prey, just like the guard did in Chapter 7 when Zed wasn't fazed by its howling and snarling. And symbolically, this is where it all ties together. Look where it ended up. The quad is representative of attacks made against the 4 ideas of objectivism, which make up a healthy, rational, and free mind. Once Zed turns the Gar away and symbolically turns that force back on itself, all of that anger and force has to go somewhere, and it's turned back on the attacker instead of its intended victim. The Gar damaging the quad is the same thing symbolically as what happens when validation and engagement are withheld from those who would attack your consent. Fighting back feeds them. Running from them feeds them. Choosing not to care what they think or feel when they make claims against you and knowing that only validation you need comes from within, and if they want it from you, either to fight them or agree with them, it comes by your choice, when and how you agree to give it for the reasons you choose. They can ask. You can agree or disagree, but they can't force you to do anything or agree with anything you don't decide to do or agree with on your own first. That is what it means when the quad as a unit is wounded by the Gar. That is what it means when Chase tells Richard you hunt the wolves by hunting their food. That is what it means when I say that person doesn't deserve your time or attention. And all you need to know is you have ownership of your own ideas without needing to make sure other people next to you agree that you are right too. And notice this isn't a magic bullet. A Gar doesn't do all the work. This type of nonviolent mental self-defense is to allow attackers to weaken themselves by trying to hurt you. It doesn't destroy them, but it does make them so weak that they will have a much harder time hurting you. By turning their own strength against them, you let them do to themselves what they tried to do to you. Create cognitive dissonance in you that was so uncomfortable that you would agree with them or become angry enough with them that you would fight back. Let them fight themselves because that is what is already happening inside them. If they truly believed what they were saying, they wouldn't need to become desperate to convince you those words need to come out of your mouth too. They would be content to know that they are correct, right? Bill says that when the two men made it clear they were looking for Kahlan, a fight broke out among the men downstairs as they argued about who was going to do what with Kahlan, and the red-haired man quickly slit the injured quad member's throat, killing him instantly. In an article written in 2016 for the U.S. National Library of Medicine titled Homicidal Cutthroat, the Forensic Perspective, they write, the length of time it takes to die following an incision wound on the neck depends on several factors. They include whether the venous or arterial systems are severed and whether there's an air embolism. In some instances, victims with a single carotid artery cut have moved for about 10 minutes before they died. But in most cases, especially when both arteries are cut, as is suggested in the above description of an ear-to-ear slice, blood supply is cut off to the brain almost immediately, leading to unconsciousness in a few seconds, and cardiac arrest due to the loss of blood in less than 1 minute. Symbolically, there is also, this is consistent with the last chapter, remember the red-haired man's problem with Richard. It wasn't, if it was only about raping Kahlan, then her story about pretending to be the one hiring Richard for the evening wouldn't have mattered. As discussed in the previous episode, the red-haired man's problem was a version of feeling challenged by thinking someone else was claiming to be better than them, much like Michael tried to do with Kahlan in Chapter 3. These handsome men who are always handsome because the members of the quad are handsome, and they're always handsome because symbolically, attacks made against the self appear seductive and attractive, and come in their mere presence creates the same dissonance the red-haired man felt last time. So he lashes out and kills the injured member of the quad. This is another version of what I've previously called the conservation of cognitive dissonance, which is a fancy way of saying that when two people clash with each other and the interaction of fighting at all feeds off itself, there is an increase in violence until one of the participants is unable to continue. And in the sense, that's why the red-haired man is able to kill the member of the quad, because symbolically, people who use these types of tricks to try and bully and insult others into choosing to give up ownership of their choices are also vulnerable to those same tricks and insults themselves. However, symbolically, it's not a fair fight against someone who is trained to inflict this type of consent-based violence and trains to practice it regularly, which we see when the innkeeper says the other healthy member of the quad retaliated by cutting down of his other customers before disappearing faster than one of two socks, which definitely enter a washing machine together, but somehow vanishes without a trace, never to be heard from again. Bill warns them that the rest of the men who weren't killed who also don't seem to be too bothered by a pile of bodies and a pool of blood, are currently arguing over who gets to be first when it comes to taking an uninvited shot at the pretty woman upstairs, who obviously was lying about hiring the services of a gigolo and must be taught a lesson for fooling them. The symbolism here is one which resonates pretty strongly with me when I try to think about what it means, because it's what happens every day around us without even realizing it. When a person engages with another with the goal of forcing their position by strength of will instead of from a desire to understand, connect, request, and convince another by their own free will, that is when a battle is fought and there is damage on both sides. This approach is one without compassion or humanity. Those who do not agree become enemies to be defeated instead of human beings to be valued as unique individuals. The way to understand this is ask yourself, have you ever seen a person willfully attack another person with their words with the intention of hurting them? If you know what I'm talking about, then you know what I mean when I say that. It damages the person being attacked by forcefully trying to strip away their right to exist as a human being with their sense of self and free will intact. If that was all that was happening, it would be terrible enough on its own, but there's also a cost to using such behavior to the person who is doing it. Human beings are remarkable creatures with the ability to use our rational minds to analyze, practice, and get better at the things we do regularly. And the more we do it, when we practice treating other people as less than human, there is something we learn about that process which makes us much better at it. We learn that being human ourselves gets in the way of our ability to treat other people as mindless yes machines whose only value is to give us back what we want from them, regardless of their own desire to do so willingly. That is the meaning behind the group of men standing around a pile of blood and bodies of their former customers, only focus on their own wants and desires. If you've seen someone in your life who is no longer seem to care about hurting another person and would do so intentionally because they had it coming, because they were obviously the kind of person that deserved to be treated that way, because they would be better off dead and have no value because their existence goes against the things you stand for, then that is the damage to the self I am talking about. I've seen people who are full of potential, intelligence, and ability with a great capacity for good forget all of that based on someone's opinion on something as silly as a single vote out of a nation of 300 million people. Somehow they had the ability to distill an entire person's life down to a single moment and make a sweeping decision about that person's value as a human being, all because they voted for the wrong letter of the alphabet. The list of rationalizations and reasons why this is okay is as endless as the destruction to that person's own heart and ability to step outside their own point of view. They become what they work to become, a deadly, angry machine which only knows pain or the absence of it. There is no room for love. There's no room for compassion. There's no room for understanding. I know everyone has seen extreme examples of this, but ask yourself, if we've been publicly trying to use the force of logic and opinion to forcefully convert or destroy those who have gotten it wrong, have you seen things get better or worse recently using that approach? Are we any closer to having the things we say we want? The better treatment 5 years ago, 10 years ago? If everything is fine and the answer is yes, then there's no problem, right? Just keep doing what we've been doing and don't change a thing. But if the most skilled and most talented of us have tried and failed to make this sort of progress, then maybe the problem isn't the skill of what is being done. Maybe it is the problem of what we're choosing to do and using the wrong tool for the job. With trouble brewing downstairs faster than trouble brews for many of us downstairs after a morning cup of coffee, with only minutes to spare, all of them make a quick turn of the page. They all make a quick, effortless turn of the page, which works on the first try, and make a coordinated escape out the back door, which in retrospect is really the same thing which happens after the consumption of the previously mentioned cup of coffee. With the bigger one taken care of first and splashed down onto the litter in the muddy waters, once again the back door is used to secure the exit of the troublemaker Zed. And much like the early morning troublemaker, the second passage is significantly more difficult than the first, as the door is momentarily blocked with a mud-covered obstacle. The red-haired man tries to sneak attack Richard, but because he's taking his time paying attention and not trying to force the exodus of the troublemaker, he is able to spot the dangerous blockage standing in his way and avoid a stabbing pain. And Richard isn't having any of that noise, so he draws the sword of truth to get the man to hold his horses for a minute while he thinks about what he did on his knees in the mud. Then Richard turns the sword of truth and clocks the guy in the head, knocking him out cold. Which is interesting to see from Richard when in chapter 37 of Temple of the Winds, we see Kahlan think about hitting someone in the head to knock them out before she decides against it, saying hitting a man across the head rarely has the desired result. Sometimes they wouldn't get knocked out, sometimes it would kill them, and she says it's only a good idea if you intend to kill them because there's a good chance that you will. In an article written in March 2019 by Dr. Ben Kim for his website, drbenkim.com, titled When to Seek Medical Intervention for a Head Injury, he writes, your brain is surrounded by 3 thin layers of connective tissue that are collectively called your meninges. I'll tell you what meninges means. The outermost meningeal layer is called the dura mater, which doesn't matter because the thin space between your dura mater and the bones make up your skull, which is called your epidural space, which is the difference because it doesn't matter in this epidural place. Along the sides of your head in the area around your temples, your epidural space houses an artery called your inside meningeal artery, whose job is to provide steady blood to your meninges. This means the portion of your skull that protects this area is quite thin and weak compared to the rest of your skull, which is why even a low-force blow in this area could lead to a fracture and a tearing of your middle meningeal artery. Per year, there are an estimated 40,000 cases of epidural hematoma. That is a bleed in the part of the brain. It's bad news, and while I'm not a doctor, my advice is to get to a hospital if you're hit in the head with a guy swinging a sword. The symbolism here is different that when Richard squared off with him in the last chapter, in the previous chapter, Richard had not drawn the sword of truth yet. He was acting from a place of rage and jealousy before he made the decision to act, which Kahlan stopped. Here, he is not acting from a place outside of reason. The red-haired man decided to attack him unprovoked, and Richard no longer has the decision if he's going to fight or not. That decision has been made for him when his consent was violated. Richard, from a position of reason and the truth, fights back against the red-haired man as the symbolic representation of his "you think you're better than me" fueled attack. And the takeaway here is when reason and the truth are the motivation, instead of a desire to force another person to agree with you, then that person becomes hopelessly weak because they are blinded by what they feel is right instead of what can easily be shown is right, that you don't have to bother with them at all. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Just because the truth is being used, that doesn't mean the truth is used as a battering ram to force another person to change their mind against their will. Richard's matter-of-fact way of handling this gives no glory of an epic engagement to the red-haired man. There's no validation be gained by a fight even happening. The red-haired man literally wants to drag Richard down into the mud with him and fight. But the truth of it is that the man doesn't deserve the fight or the validation he is seeking. That is the symbolic representation of this fight. The truth of the matter is you don't need to fight to win. You win by not fighting most of the time. And when the other person thinks that your choice doesn't matter, they are the ones already covered in mud. But it's still a choice to go down there and get dirty with them at the same time. The warning from the author is that you can make that decision. They have the weapons to use, which make it a damaging experience if you decide you're going to go into the mud and duke it out with them. After the red-haired man is unconscious in a heap, Kahlan finds Randy on the ground with his swollen eye. And while that is mud in his pockets, he is happy to see Kahlan. He apologizes and says the man took him by surprise. Kahlan gives him a quick hug that he will most likely be fantasizing about for decades to come and says, "Don't worry about it." And we never see or hear about Randy ever again. I hope he's able to lead a good life, even though he is surrounded by the dead bodies of angry men who might have angry friends which aren't dead, who may decide that Bill needs to be taught a lesson for owning a building where Dahair and quad members killed them. Randy's encounter with the red-haired man is exactly what I was talking about above. Randy is a symbol for a well-intentioned but inexperienced and vulnerable young man who loves justice, because he is motivated by the love of justice and not a love of looking at a situation from every perspective. Even though he is well-intentioned and good, he is vulnerable and easily taken off guard. This is even represented by his injury. Notice how it's his eye that's swollen shut. He's left temporarily blind, partially from that encounter, blinded by his own feelings and caught off guard, and then blinded by his interaction with the red-haired man. Luckily for him, Richard and Kahlan are there to help him out. The way to think about this interaction in the real world is to ask yourself if you've ever known someone who was good at making other people feel better after a rough interaction they had with someone else. Like a sympathetic friend who knew the value of listening and making you feel heard. What this also means is that when we fall in the mud and become blind to how we are being hurt or how we're hurting ourselves, after the damage is done, that doesn't mean we can't get a helping hand from a friend every now and then. And that is what helps pick us up and can help get us a little bit cleaned off when we go down into the mud and maybe get hurt doing something stupid. Kahlan gives Randy some silver to pay for the other half of her horse care, and Richard, still very angry from having drawn the sword of truth and using it, even in a non-lethal fashion, yells at Bill. He says, add everything to his tally books, the damage to his property, the trouble to him and the time it would take to fix, grave markers for the criminals and rapists, and whatever he thinks is a fair fee for saving their lives. He also isn't above playing the first counselor's brother card when it will help him do the right thing. He says if they won't pay, he will find the man responsible and have his head on a pike in front of his brother's own home. According to some fast and loose calculations put together, the total amount in Bill's tally book would have been around $72,690 and my 2 cents. $90 for a one-night stay in a one-star hotel, an estimated $20,000 to repair the damage to his inn, including new furniture and walls and floors to remove the blood and corpses, and an estimated $500 for grave markers. The value of Bill's pain, suffering, and trouble would be calculated based on any medical expenses and lost income while his business was being rebuilt, and is calculated by taking an average annual profit of $30,000, which is on the low end of a standard profit margin hotel chain, what they can expect to make, and dividing it by the amount of time it would take to rebuild his inn. Given the simple wooden construction and assuming access to materials and skilled labor, along with the time required to gather these resources, I've put that time at 3 to 4 weeks and have given it a monetary value of $2,000. For possible medical care for his son, I've used the conversion of help from a healer at a percentage of an equivalent value to the load of supplies. Richard and Kahlan took 80. As she ended up helping Zed and Chase for almost 2 weeks, using specialized knowledge and round-the-clock care, while Randy would require nothing more than an ointment and some sound advice on how to keep it clean and cared for while it healed on his own, calculated at a value of $100. While it would be impossible to find this level of care today at this price, keep in mind that 80 isn't being regulated by the government, which is funded by the medical industry to co-opt the insurance industry to funnel tax dollars into paying for ridiculous profit margin at everyone's expense, except the companies who profit and the senators and representatives who are compensated handsomely for passing laws to allow this. Finding the fair value for saving someone's life, that was a bit trickier, but I was able to find a reference for maritime law contained within the repository of law at University of Michigan titled Compensation and Reward for Saving Life at Sea, which upon reading yielded information referencing $1,000 as a normal compensation value for saving a life back in the 1800s. The economic frame of reference used so far throughout the series to calculate and convert value. Converting to a value of approximately $20,000 in today's money. Using the previously calculated conversion of modern-day dollars to gold coins, that would work out to 96 gold coins and some silver pieces. Given Bill's tendency to exaggerate and fatten his tally book wherever possible, and the fact that the first counselor's brother was one of the lives saved, I don't think it's unreasonable to round that number up to an even 100 gold coins. And we never hear about this man or his money ever again. Now, I am a fan of a story with a happy ending as much as the next reader. And as much as this scene feels like a good place to end the story of Bill on a happy note, I think there is strong evidence that Bill never sees a single copper coin from the Council of Westland. Before I rain on everyone's parade, in the interests of all fairness, let me make a case for a hypothetical situation which turns out well for Bill. It's entirely possible that this bill is submitted by Bill to the Tally Bill Committee to tally his bananas. The invoice is paid and rubber stamped for fear of angering the first counselor, especially since his brother was involved. I don't want to take that hope away from somebody. It's possible that Bill and Randy got a nice fat insurance settlement to ride off into the sunset with and start a new and better life, with about 2 years of his standard estimated income to make that transition. I want to make this perfectly clear. Knowing what I have seen about the way big governments and big corporations operate, especially when it comes to giving money to anyone who doesn't know the secret handshake of mutual exploitation of anyone who doesn't know the secret handshake, I think something very different happened from the happy ending, which the words of this chapter imply at face value. Here's what I think happened based on the information I have. Bill can't wait to rebuild his livelihood and starts the process of reaching out to contractors as well as purchasing materials needed to reconstruct his inn. All of this is set in motion by invoking the credit of the first counselor's brother. The wheels start moving, and while that's happening, Bill quickly submits his tally book to those who review and approve such things. Given the dollar amount attached to this, combined with the invocation of the first counselor's brother, it is inevitable that word of this would quickly reach Michael, not only because his brother was involved, but also because of the monetary value attached to this claim. No one on a committee would be willing to put their neck out there without prior approval from a higher up on the political food chain. So the first thing that would happen is payment would be withheld pending an investigation, and Bill would likely agree that's fair given the circumstances. Bill would assume that there is no way that such a thing could end poorly because it's the first counselor's brother, and he would convince his contractors to keep working on his word. Information of this makes it to Michael, and he quickly gets a new data point for where Richard was and when he was there, along with the previous data points of villagers who think Zed is a warlock, the broken branches and burnt trees by warlock powers on the path to Chase's house, a trail of chicken bones leading from Chase's house to the series of farmers who saw Chase on his way to the boundary, past the broken bridge, which was one of the likely routes of egress, straight to Bill's busted up and broken inn, giving Michael, or more likely Dark and Rawl, enough information to piece together where they are going and what they're trying to do. Michael wouldn't care about the damage to Bill's property, and given Bill's level of anxiety about what the army would and wouldn't do, it wouldn't take very much convincing to make him agree that his life is valuable, and he should be thankful for getting away with that. Given the level of technology and information exchange, suppressing information such as this is far easier and has been shown many times within the Sword of Truth series that messages from the government are readily consumed when they reach the common people for their consumption, regardless of the truth behind that. Where have we heard that for mainstream media news, both left and right? Bill gets stuck with the bill and is now $30,000 in debt for his property renovations, being left to fend for himself with no monetary reward for his good deeds. But then you may ask, what about Richard's promise to put the head of the man responsible for making this decision on a pike? In chapter 49 of Wizard's First Rule, Richard orders the execution of his brother just a few pages before the book ends. We're told at the base of the steps is Michael's personal army, formerly known as the Home Guard. In front of that is Chase with Michael's head on a pole. We aren't ever told what happens to Bill directly, but Richard did give his word about what would happen to the man responsible if Bill wasn't paid. His head would end up on a pike in front of his brother's house, and in chapter 49, Michael's head ends up on a pike in front of his brother's home guard. I think that's enough information for me to realize Bill got shortchanged. At the very least, in this instance, unlike the promise to return the clothing Kahlan takes from Chase's wife, or the knife he borrows from Chase, Bill's hardship is not the result of Richard forgetting to keep his word. Richard kept his word, just not the one possible path which would have turned out well for Bill. Bill thinks that's the funniest thing he's ever heard, but Richard's still furious that the red-haired man is passed out in the mud and says the only reason he didn't kill him was because by killing the quad member, he may have saved Kahlan's life. Richard tells Bill that even though he was useful in one very specific instance, once he wakes up and starts acting on his own again, he's liable to start wrecking up the place. Better to make sure he never wakes up again by hanging him. And also, be careful because the boundary's failing. Bill doesn't seem to have a problem with taking advice from Richard about this and decides it's a good idea. Then he reveals that he knew Richard was the seeker of truth the entire time, causing Richard to realize he was wrong about Bill's devious nature. There's a bit of subtlety here in the symbolism, but it's beautiful and really connects everything the author writes about later when Richard figures out the truth. The red-haired man represents the violent ways we can interact with others when it comes to verbal attacks against our own free will. What the author is saying here is even something as thin as a sheet of paper has two sides. There is a tremendous potential for harm and abuse, and that is undeniably true. And that is what Richard means when he says the man is guilty of murder, intent to murder, and intent to rape. The red-haired man is representative of every different way a person can violate the consent of another. It's what happens anytime a person tries to make another person agree with them without asking for permission first. It's also true that others act like members of the quad when they interact with us. They attempt to kill that which gives us our free will. The subtle truth here is that the members of the quad are vulnerable to the red-haired man, especially when the red-haired man attacks unannounced. The author isn't telling us what we should or shouldn't do with this symbolism. He's just telling us what it is. When someone attacks our consent, they are vulnerable to attacks against their own. And that means the right attack from their own blind spots can quickly and decisively end the threat. But the cost of that is a violation of the fundamental right to choose. The symbolism in there are many paths to resolution. Some paths end better for us, and some paths end better for others. When the number of choices seems limited and the time is running out to make one, a person can be faced with an undeniable vision that doing nothing will be a death sentence. In that moment, their only other choice is to take the death sentence meant for your own free will and turn it back on itself so that the one who would take that from you loses it instead. Luckily, we aren't talking about life and death in this instance, only the choice to respect another person's right to choose as much as you respect your own choice to choose. Where do you draw that line? And what would you do to protect yourself when another person crosses it against your will? Will you do nothing and let your ability to choose be killed? After it happens, would you spend time asking yourself if there was another way, if only you'd been able to think of it? There's a lot of meaning in such a short and seemingly simple scene, but there is great power in small truths sometimes, isn't there? Richard and Kahlan leave South Haven and travel down the road under cover of darkness. Even though it's dark and rainy, the horses are all like rain and darkness. What? They aren't bothered by it at all, since they are trained to handle this kind of duty. Thick gray clouds, all heavy with rain, follow Richard and Kahlan as they travel to find Adie, the bone woman. As they ride, Richard is full of worry. He's worried about the last member of the quad striking them when they aren't ready. He's worried about his friends, and the more he worries about those things, the more he is able to come up with even more things to worry about, until eventually he remembers some good advice from an old, trusted, and currently unconscious friend. Worry about what is, not what might be. And once he starts doing this, it turns out to be a wise decision because there are a lot of very real things he should be thinking about, like what the murder of his father means and how he's going to help his friends, and what's the deal with the woman he's with. If Chase is still symbolic of a person's sense of independence and self-reliance, then his horses are an extension of that symbolism. Even in the dark, while Richard and Kahlan can't see where they're going, the horses act as though they are perfectly capable of picking the right path. They serve as a guide to connect them from where they are now to where they want to go. As far as the advice on worrying goes, I don't really need to touch on the symbolism for a while because there is no symbolism. It's actually just a straightforward, unvarnished piece of good advice. It's no coincidence that Zed's phrase, "think of the solution and not the problem," is one of the most often quoted lines from the entire Sword of Truth series. Have you ever asked yourself a version of this question when you were feeling a bit overwhelmed? Because I know that I have, and it's served me quite well. After traveling in the rain for some time, Richard notices the terrain has changed somehow. He describes it as looking the same yet being presented differently, transformed from a place of terror into a place of peace, using the same building blocks in a different way. A smell of birch smoke fills the air as Richard narrates that the men from the inn wouldn't be near this place because their mere presence would be a violation just by comparison alone. They aren't good enough to be here. Adie lives in a house next to the boundary. Symbolically, this is someone who is very comfortable dealing with uncomfortable thoughts. Thoughts which have the potential to trigger powerful fight or flight urges. Thoughts people have a hard time thinking about, and thoughts which make rational human beings turn into less rational creatures. The way to understand this type of thing is just ask if you've met someone who seems to be calm and collected, no matter the situation. Can you think of anyone in your life who was a source of strength, capable of keeping a level head no matter what was going on around them? Or perhaps you are that person for other people. Most of us, myself included, it often seems to be a little bit of both, isn't it? If how all of that ties to Adie is still a little bit cloudy, the author gives us a hint when he tells us about the smell of birch smoke. Have you ever asked yourself why Richard's job was as a woods guide? Aside from the symbolism of a person needing to have their integrity guide them and make decisions, the choice of Richard as a woods guide instead of a different kind of guide provides a nice layer of symbolism about what the author's sense of integrity can tell you just by paying attention to your surroundings. In Chapter 5 of Temple of the Winds, when Richard asks General Curson to find a common and simple kind of tree, he says, he could tell 10 different kinds of steel apart just by touching them, but he can't tell one set of trees from another, even if he had an extra set of eyes. He literally can't see the forest for the trees. The symbolism of the different types of trees Richard is commonly noticing during his journey is symbolic of the intuition that integrity has about its surrounding. For example, when they reach 80 to help heal Chase and Zed, Richard smells birch smoke, which according to our good friends at treesymbolism.com is a common symbol of protection, regeneration, and new beginning. Without understanding why just yet, Richard recognizes this as a different place than the other places near the boundary. When I get to the part about which virtue 80 represents in a few minutes, that symbolism will make perfect sense. And for any of you out there that like the character 80, perhaps this will give you some new reasons to like her even more. 80's house is described as one which blends into its surroundings, almost indistinguishable from the forest around it. The house is described as appearing to grow from the forest floor and is surrounded by ferns. The house has a simple roof and a porch good enough for sitting on. None of the windows in 80's house have any curtains. Standing in the middle of a patch of ferns, right in the middle of the path, they see a tall woman who is taller than Kahlan and is definitely taller than Kahlan. No matter how many times I read the damn stories, Hollywood has forever taken the archetype of wise old woman and turned her into this short and hunched over thing, which 80 clearly is not, but damn it if it didn't take me a long time to override that TV trope presentation. She is described as a strong woman with handsome features, old and grizzled but not used up. She is also missing a foot. The symbolism of the lack of curtains and the presence of ferns sets the tone for 80. So does her physical size. Symbolically, she is more than Kahlan, the symbol for justice, but she is less than Richard, the symbol of integrity. The ferns are symbolic of honesty and integrity, which is to say that honesty is at the core and integrity is able to grow from honesty and expand beyond itself. 80's house is out in the open, and anyone who wants to can walk by and look inside her windows. There is nothing hidden without very good reasons. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, kids of all ages, step right up to the marvelous wheel of the virtues of objectivism. That's right, come on now, don't be shy. Go on and give the wheel a spin. Round and round she goes. Where she stops, nobody knows. And look at that thing go. Where will it land at the many, many different options? While the wheel does its thing, let's take a look at some of the choices it may settle on. That's right, folks, it could be any one of these. So strap yourself in and play close attention. We have honesty, truthful, trustworthy, straightforward, blunt, reliable, genuine, free-spoken, followed by candid, upfront, plain speaking, plain spoken, believable, factual, frank, authentic, genuine, and bona fide. That's right, you can imagine how easily it could be any one of these fine choices. Here she goes, but don't call me Shirley. And look at that baby stop as the fantastic and wonderful wheel of objectivist virtue lands on, drum roll, please. Honesty. As a character in the Sword of Truth series, 80 is symbolic of honesty. In objectivism, honesty has two flavors. One which tastes like something we eat, and one which tastes like our own tongue. The first one is the one that tastes like something we can eat. That is honesty with others, which is not to be confused with robotic truth-telling absent the consequences when information is sought after with sinister intent behind it, like the Sisters of Light later on in the series. It is the ability of a person to make their word worth something to the right people, because those people will have no doubt in their minds when you give them a promise or an answer that you will get exactly what you told them they wanted. The second flavor of honesty is the kind you can't taste. This is an honesty with the self. The ability to look at our own words, actions, decisions, and beliefs and ask ourselves, am I really doing or thinking the right thing? Does what I believe align with the goals I have for myself? Am I putting the right things or the wrong things first? When is the last time you saw someone who acted one way, but you could see they weren't really being honest with themselves? Was that something they were able to see? And if you can see how easy it is for others to miss, how can any of us be sure that we aren't doing it ourselves the same way? If a person's goal is comfort, then honesty with the self is the enemy. If a person's goal is growth, then honesty with the self is not optional. In the next section about the character's first interactions with 80, I'll list all of the instances where she is focused and clear on honesty like a laser beam. The woman gives one of the best self-introductions in recent literary history when she says, "I be 80, who be you?" And Richard says, "It's just 4 friends, nothing to worry about here," even though one of those people she knows, the one person that she knows at all, is tied to a wooden sled with blood on his face being dragged through the mud, alongside of another unconscious person and 2 people she doesn't know. 80 corrects Richard and reminds him that there are 3 strangers in front of her and 1 friend, and that she is allowed to decide if the rest of them are friends or not. Richard decides now is a good time to literally and figuratively get off his high horse and introduce himself and Kahlan to 80 on equal ground. 80 gives Richard the once-over and then turns her focus on Kahlan and addresses her in a language Richard doesn't fully understand, and uses her full title. Kahlan is on high alert. While Richard can't understand the words, he compares Kahlan to a feisty feline on high alert. Feline, feeling fine. Feline, la 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 la, feline. He also notices they are testing each other in ways he doesn't understand, feline. He also notices that he needs 80's help, and if she wanted to, she could harm them. And he realizes that the sword of truth wouldn't be of any use against this blind old woman. First of all, symbolically, 80 doesn't take any crap from anyone and calls it like she sees it. Stepping off the horse to speak with her on solid ground represents what integrity and justice must do if honesty is going to be any help to them. Notice how Kahlan and 80 seem very suspicious of each other at first. And the reason for that is simple. Honesty and justice need to keep a tight, close eye on each other to make sure one or the other isn't being ignored, because it happens. And when it happens, integrity is the one that suffers. The references to the different language being spoken and not understanding how they're testing each other is meant to show that integrity can't get involved until justice and honesty decide what the right thing to do is. The reason that the sword of truth wouldn't be able to help them against 80 is that honesty has nothing to fear from the truth. Honesty is just a willingness to see the truth as it is, warts and all. 80 is satisfied enough with what she sees to ask Richard to get to the part of the conversation why he tells her why they came to her house. While Richard is telling her that they needed her help, 80 begins doing a spot-on impersonation of a human lie detector, proclaiming every one of his statements as either true or false. 80 says it's true when Richard says they need her help. That it's true 2 of his friends are hurt. True that Del Bradstone told them 80 was a friend of his. Richard is doing well so far and starts to feel more comfortable. So he goes on to say he got a hot tip in South Haven about 80's ability to help them. So they decided to get some supplies in return for her help. But 80 is having none of that noise and says the only word which matters as a result. She says, lie. She adds a bit of theatrics, a concept foreign to me, and thumps her cane for good measure, causing Richard and Kahlan to jerk back in surprise. In 2004, in an article written by the American Psychological Association titled The Truth About Lie Detectors, we learned that a traditional polygraph machine measures 3 things: heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and skin conductivity. Several questioning techniques are commonly used in polygraph tests. The most widely used test format for subjects in criminal incident investigations is the control question test, the CQT. The CQT compares responses to relevant questions, did you shoot your wife, with control questions. The control questions are designed to control for the effect and are generally threatening nature of the relevant questions. So meaning they ask simple questions that they know will be true or false to get a baseline reading. Control questions concern misdeeds that are similar to those being investigated, but refer to the subject's past and are usually broad in scope. For example, have you ever betrayed anyone who trusted you? A person who's telling the truth is assumed to fear control questions, which are designed to arouse the subject's concern about their past truthfulness. While later, the relevant questions ask about a crime they know they did not commit. The effectiveness of polygraph machines is something many experts within the field disagree with. However, there is much debate about the effectiveness of fMRI technology. That is where the body is put inside an MRI machine and asked questions. Then technicians monitor the parts of the brain as the person answers. While it's possible to control external physical factors such as blood pressure and heart rate, it's not so easy to turn parts of the brain on or off when a bit of creative truth-telling is being used to deceive. With our current level of medical science, it's already possible to look inside a person's head and see if they are lying or telling the truth. Would it surprise you to learn that there are those who would prefer it if you didn't give that little piece of medical technology much credibility? Off the top of my head, I can think of a few important individuals I might have some questions for if I could be sure they were telling the truth when they answered. Richard is so surprised by Adie's immediate rejection of his statement as true that he is blind to the reason she said it. Instead of asking her what she means, he feels like he must not have used the right word, so he tries to say the same thing again. He says the supplies are there and we thought, but Adie isn't having any of that noise and says, lie, again, punctuated with another cane thumping. Richard does the same thing everyone else does when someone has a different point of view that they don't accept as presented. He gets annoyed, crosses his arms, and with his internal temper rising, he asks her, albeit grudgingly, to tell him where the lie is. Adie is blind, and as a result has been forced to rely on her other senses. She uses hearing, touch, and the gift to see. I'd often wondered how Adie was able to know when people were telling the truth and when they were not. The previous section on lie detection shows such a thing is possible with the right training and interpretation of the signals. Instead of an MRI machine, Adie has access to the gift and her other senses. In Blood of the Fold, we're shown Adie's ability to reach out and find the hearts of people so she can stop them, which means she is able to sense the shape and location of the heart. With this information, it's reasonable to assume that she can also do it with the other organs and vital statistics of the body, including the metrics which are used in lie detection. There's also significance to Adie thumping her cane. When she does this, notice how she does it right after the moment of the lie, followed by a sharp and raspy presentation of this position. In an article written in 2017 for neurosciencenews.com titled Exploring the Potential of Human Echolocation, they explored the idea that echolocation can benefit visually impaired people to navigate safely through the environment, and people who are visually impaired will often use a cane to feel out their surroundings. With training and practice, people can learn to use the pitch, loudness, and timbre of echoes from the cane or other sounds to navigate freely through their environment using primitive echolocation. The majority of the people use tapping their canes to echolocate. The action calls less attention to themselves, but others add their own sounds like clicking, shushing, snapping noises to detect objects around them. Adie does both. She makes a sharp sound with the word lie, and she also uses a firm thump of the cane. She produces two shockwaves of sound which invisibly bounce off of Richard and Kahlan, giving her a moment of increased clarity. Symbolically, that is what honesty does to justice and integrity. It listens, analyzes, and when it senses any form of deception, it stops everything dead in its tracks and sends out a call for analysis. But there is nothing there beyond the call to listen which feels like a lie. It's up to integrity to listen when honesty speaks, even when it doesn't want to. When that decision is made, the truth is found. That's why Richard feels like the sword is useless. It's literally symbolically putting the cart before the horse. Honesty is the cause. Truth is the effect. A good way to understand this is to ask yourself if you've ever known a person who had problems with honesty before. What sort of trouble did that cause for you? Or have you known someone who could always be counted on to keep their word no matter what? What was the difference between knowing one and knowing the other? Adie tells him it wasn't a group decision to bring her supplies. It was his decision. He should have used the word I instead of we. Richard looks at Adie and doesn't see the problem. And Adie sees the problem, but she can't look at Richard. She tells him one is the truth and one is not. And that's a big enough difference to make the distinction worth the trouble in her eyes. She can see that Adie thinks it's time well spent. Richard says Chase must have a hard time indulging any of his nonsense with her. Adie confirms that is the truth and tells Richard to bring his friends inside. So why is Adie the symbol for honesty? Why is she blind? I'll give you my theory, and it's rooted in an article for 2by4.org in 2010 written by Michael Rock titled, If You Don't See the Fnord, It Can't Eat You. The article delves heavily into mainstream media organizations and the mechanisms large organizations use to organize their power. To make his point, the author invents the word Fnord and uses it as a stand-in for unresolved contradiction, like claiming to know the exact value of pi, that is Fnord. The number that comes after 23 but before 21, that is Fnord. Where to buy turn signal fluid for, that is Fnord. And what politician is 100% good and 100% evil, that sort of thing. Contradictions presented as statements of fact and hidden within larger messages. The author writes, powerful associations are embedded in the subconscious mind of the reader. The Fnord triggers a vague but visceral feeling of dread and confusion that shades the rational consideration of the text. Fnords purposefully riddle the text of every book, newspaper, and magazine, thereby linking all information with sensations of fear and uncertainty. How do you feel after watching the news? He goes on to say, this is a conditioned response. Does the news make you angry? This first conditioned reflex was experienced, the panic reaction. They're going to take away your guns or abortions. The activation syndrome, it's technically called, whenever they encounter the word Fnord. What is this guy even talking about now? The second conditioned reflex was to black out what happened. That doesn't make sense. Of course it doesn't make sense. These people are our friends, including the word itself, Fnord. 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 You're not even going to remember that. And just all of it creates a general low-grade sense of emergency, and people don't know why. And the third step, of course, which is to attribute this anxiety to the news stories, which are already bad enough in themselves. So, of course, the essence of control is this low-grade fear. Fnords produce a whole population walking around in chronic, low-grade emergency sense, feeling tormented. How have you felt for the last 2 weeks watching the news? I won't go so far as to claim that the author's assertion is true about this, but I will point out that it very closely mirrors the behavior I've been describing about the fight or flight instinct hijacking most of the decisions we make in our daily lives. It's a dead-on comparison for what the creator of the original theory of cognitive dissonance described, and it's at the core, in a different way, of writing down the wizard's first rule. 4 different humans working to create something all found different words to describe the same thing without ever meeting or talking to one another. That feels more like a coincidence to me. If nothing else, it's worth exploring. All of that ties into 80's blindness because she literally cannot see the lies and deceptions being told to her with her lies. She is blind to the Fnords. They cannot eat her. Even though honesty is blind, it can still see enough to know a person's sense of justice is an efficient way to bypass their critical thinking skills along with their compassion and humanity. Once Chase and Zed are taken inside, Richard can see why 80 is called the Bone Woman. He sees bones in all shapes and sizes decorating the walls. He notices that many of them look like they belong to scary-looking inhuman monsters. Some of them are piled up in the corner on the floor like scraps of leftover wood, potentially useful to have access to, but not nearly as important or refined as the more finished and important pieces on the wall. Chase and Zed are brought inside, and Richard notices that 80 is dry, even though she was standing out with them in the rain. That makes Richard nervous, and he thinks he wouldn't be here if he didn't trust Chase as much as he does. Using the symbology from before for underworld beasts being the lies we believe, which make a person choose to act like they don't have the choices they really do, then that is consistent with choosing to view 80 as a symbol of honesty. All of those arguments always share the same lie, told in 1,000 different ways. The lie is there is no other choice but to do, think, or believe, and there is no point in acting like there is. That is the lie. The way to understand this is ask yourself, have you ever met someone who was calm, rational, and kind, but also uncompromising in certain areas, where no amount of calling a spade anything but a spade was acceptable to them? If you have met that person, then you understand what 80 represents. The only thing needed to protect oneself from this is to know that when a person decides they have no ability to choose, which is different than deciding what choices they wish they had, they decide to choose to act like they have no free will. That is allowed. People have full ownership over their choices, including choosing to act like they aren't making a choice. When another person tries to present this position to them and does so with authority, honesty with the self and honesty with the world are all this is required to stay safe and out of the rain. The beasts on the wall are the slain arguments made against the most fundamental of rights to all things which have the consciousness to recognize it. That is the ability to choose, which is spelled out in the words of the wizard's 13th rule. We cannot change the nature of humanity by force, violence, or imprisonment. The only approach which can be used and succeed is one using truth and love, honesty and compassion, two traits 80 seems to have, without allowing one to compromise the other. When Richard lays Zed down, 80 asks who that person he is laying down is, and Richard tells 80 the truth to the question she asked by giving his name, and the truth by answering a question she didn't ask when he says he is a friend. 80 gets Richard to yell at her by saying the word wizard, and Richard repeats the important part of this interaction from his perspective by shouting back that he is a friend. 80 takes her hands and puts them on his stomach, swirling it around before taking it back and announcing that his anger comes from the proper place, the truth, and that the good don't need to fear that. She does the same thing by placing her hand on Kahlan and says that Kahlan has the anger of the tongue and that everyone needs to fear it, including Kahlan, if she ever lets it out. 80 didn't make a mistake here by provoking Richard. She was testing him without his knowledge. Her first test is when they're outside, she tells him when he isn't being honest with himself, which he accepts graciously and recognizes. Her second test is to see what happens when someone tries to convince him that one thing being true does not negate another, which is also true. When he sees a violation of the wizard's 9th rule, it makes him angry. 80 makes a connection with Richard by using her hand to feel the reaction going on inside him. She doesn't judge the action before seeking the intent behind it. Rather than know what is in a person's heart before making her decisions, she tried to figure out from their perspective so that she could know exactly what was going on. This causes her to deem that Richard makes good choices when presented with honesty and when presented with things that seem to be lies. This makes sense looking at Richard as a symbol for integrity. He knows right and wrong. He can see right and wrong within himself and can sense right and wrong when it's being projected on him. He gets angry when that projection is one meant to reduce his integrity. 80 says the same thing about Kahlan that I've been saying about justice in the previous videos. She has intensity, but there is danger that if it's ever let out on its own. The implication being that as her being drawn into the boundary wall by the monsters a few chapters ago, it's the same thing. The symbolic death of the rational mind as well as a potential damage to the rational minds around her. A good way to understand 80's feelings in this is to go back to Kahlan's stories about Darkenrahl in Chapter 5, where people wanting to do good are led to commit murder because their sense of justice has been hijacked, convincing them that killing is the proper course of action when words may have been a better way to peace. But Richard isn't having any of that noise, and he says he doesn't understand, and then blames her for not telling him the things she sees clearly in words that he can understand. So 80 does what any good teacher would do when a student says they don't understand the lesson. She uses different words to try and make her point. She tries to answer the question in the form of a question and ask what type of magic is stronger, the magic of the truth or the teeth? The magic of the tongue, words. Which one is better, Mr. Richard Cipher? Richard lets 80 know that he still doesn't understand by making fun of the exercise and that then she does what any good teacher would do in her situation. She tries to use different words to make the same point when she tells him to put a sock in it and think before he speaks, Fnord. Richard gets embarrassed and 80 feels like she has made some progress in helping him understand, but has not yet achieved total victory. She asks him if he understands that she bonked him over the head with it, and he says he doesn't, but then he acts like he does by actually paying attention to the words coming out of her mouth. 80 considers his progress and proceeds to explain that the magic of the truth is violent, it's forceful, it rips and destroys by contact and direct interaction, and that the magic of the tongue can be just as destructive, Fnord, but doesn't need to make contact to do so. Richard still isn't sure what she means, but this time instead of making fun of her example, she tells her that he isn't sure what she means, and she touches him with a little bit of honesty, and he gets a vision of the men in South Haven and how he was ready to use his power to kill them to stop them, and how Kahlan was able to use the power of her words to accomplish the same thing without killing them. 80 shows him 3 different ways that the power of words have the ability to change a person and how they're going to react, so long as that person doesn't understand what is behind their decision to use the words they've chosen. The magic of the truth is just like what I've been saying, where there is a collision of ideas, there's violence, and even when victory is achieved, it's done so by force of contact, and there's a price to be paid for that force of contact. Just the same as people who feel drained after an intense argument which ends in a favorable resolution. The truth was found, but the method of pursuing it was a hard path to follow, a path of combat. The magic of the tongue is the ability to use words to invoke feelings in others. It's the ability to recognize ideas and expressions of words people are vulnerable to, and then use that vulnerability to distract them from the truth of what is in front of them. Fnord. Words which are not fully understood cause the self to fnord itself. The cause fnord. They need explanation and fnord. A very simple way to visualize this is to ask yourself if you have ever seen fnord, someone who got so caught up in defending their own words and actions that they forgot to actually say much of anything beyond that fnord at all. The magic of the tongue is when words attempt to influence a decision. Their effectiveness is given to them by those who do not recognize the choices fnord in front of them. The magic succeeds when the choice is not understood fnord from their perspective and feels like there is no choice fnord at all, but ends with an action being called to take the person that is being used on. So that means the very end of all of these interactions are always tied to a call to action of what you need to do, fnord, to make the uncomfortable feeling go away. And in this instance, making that uncomfortable fnord feeling go away would be something as simple as inviting people to my Facebook group. Or say a politician telling you to vote for them. These sort of innocent but self-serving requests which are tied to this uncomfortable thing, fnord. Yes, if you subscribe to my Facebook group, all of a sudden, everything that was feeling uncomfortable, fnord, about that, goes away. That's the promise. That is the magic of the tongue. The magic of the tongue is the ability to create feelings and then exploit them. The magic of the truth is violent by contact. In this section, it happens when Adie tells him to zip it and stop being dumb. She attacks the need for validation by sharply removing all traces of it and replacing it with its opposite, active disapproval. She then ties this to a call to action, which is for Richard to think before he speaks. That call to action could have just as easily been shut up and do what you're told. The only difference in this moment between Adie, Zed, and Dark and Rahl is what they do with that moment, where a call to action is possible. Adie and Zed use it to help the person that they are using it on. Dark and Rahl uses it in ways which will help him. The knowledge and execution of this are all the same tool, going back to Zed's opinions on intent. It isn't the tool, it's the builder and what they choose to use that tool to do. Kahlan isn't taking kindly to Adie putting her hand on Richard to kindly help him remember exactly what he needs to remember to understand what she was trying to tell him. So she not so kindly puts her hand on Adie and gives the blind old woman some knowledge that if she doesn't explain what she's doing to Richard, and quick, she will have bigger problems on her hands than arguing over how many people decided to get her supplies in exchange for help. Kahlan tries to remain respectful and does realize she may be overreacting a bit, but she isn't about to be taking any chances with the only seeker of truth that she has. Adie takes a moment to look at the situation and tells Kahlan, and I quote, "Forgive me, child, for thoughtlessly giving you cause for alarm." The old woman removes her hand from Richard, and Kahlan responds by removing her hand from Adie. There are two interesting points of symbolism here. One of them is simple and the other is very subtle. The first one, the easy one. Adie, as the symbol of honesty, touches Richard, the symbol for integrity. While this causes Richard pain to relive, he does grow from it, and he is beginning to understand what Adie is doing. Kahlan, the symbol for justice, doesn't understand what's happening is good for Richard. She only knows that she sees him in pain. So she reacts to the threat and puts her hand on Adie to interact with her. Adie changes Richard by touching him in the same way that honesty changes integrity by touching it. That is the lesson. Kahlan touches Adie and makes it clear that she can change Adie if she wants to just by touching her. And once we know more about Kahlan's power, this becomes much more of a strong warning. What the symbolism here is saying is a misguided sense of justice has the power to destroy honesty. And that makes sense, right? That's just like looking at someone who can listen to a hard truth, see the honesty in it, and be made a better person for it in the first case. And looking at someone who is so caught up in a cause or idea where honesty can no longer reach them. I've met a few of those people before. I am fortunate to know the first and find it wise to avoid the second. Now, for the more subtle message hidden within 80's response to Kahlan, she apologizes for thoughtlessly giving her cause for alarm. Her words to Kahlan are far more than a simple apology. In fact, that isn't even really for Kahlan at all. The words are for herself. She is being honest enough to admit to herself that she made a mistake. When she thoughtlessly gave her cause for alarm, what she is doing is recognizing that the sense of justice does not have the ability to make rational choices when it feels threatened. It can be very dangerous and does not have the ability to regulate itself. That task falls to the individual making the choice about how to act. It's more of a prayer for mercy than it is an apology. Not because she made Kahlan feel threatened, but because her mistake brought her right to the point of total destruction. That's why she also refers to Kahlan as child, as someone who doesn't understand the big feelings they're having. That is the warning in 80's apology. If we are not honest about our own sense of justice and realize that it can strike back at us when it feels threatened, then our sense of justice has the ability to destroy our honesty with ourselves. 80 explains that the magic of truth, the teeth, work together with the magic of the tongue, words. She also says having access to the magic of the truth gives him the magic of the tongue because he backs it with the truth. She looks at Kahlan slowly and tells her she has both the magic of the teeth and the magic of the tongue, with one backing the other. 80's tone here is implied with her body language. With Richard, she is explaining things as they are and as they should be. Richard's magic only works in one direction. He can use his words, and his words only have power because the truth is behind it. That is the meaning of the tongue being backed by the teeth. When she turns her head to Kahlan slowly, it might help to imagine a very low light, like someone is telling a scary story where some sinister music plays in the background. She tells Kahlan that she has both magics, but one backs the other, and that means that Kahlan is able to use her words with the truth behind them, just like Richard can. But it also means that Kahlan is able to direct the truth, or at least the truth as she sees it, and back that with her words. That is, when she destroys her honesty, then the truth from her perspective becomes whatever she wants it to be. It can be changed and invented on the spot. A good example of this can be found within the comments of any social media conversation where the goal is to make one person's word come out of another person's mouth without their consent. Can you think of any examples where you've seen people grasp at unverified facts, figures, news, and information just to make their position seem stronger, for no other reason than it seems to make their argument just a little bit more powerful? Think about that person in that moment and what are they feeling? Do they feel like they're doing the right thing by defending what they think is right? They might be right, or they might be totally off base, but think about what they're feeling. Zed would compare this to Dark and Rawl not thinking he's evil, only that he thinks what he's doing is right. Then ask yourself, is that person being honest with himself, or is he falling victim to the wizard's first rule by letting their desire to feel right cloud their ability to know right? Richard asks about other kinds of magic, and 80 lets him know that there are many kinds. Zed knows a lot of it, and he's a very dangerous man because of it. Richard reminds 80 that he is kind and gentle, which he says is true, but does not ignore his ability to produce great calamity at a moment's notice. The conversation turns to Dark and Rawl, and she says he can use all of the magic a wizard can, and some of the magic he can't. As mentioned in previous chapters, the symbolism of the magic Zed can use is his knowledge of the wizard's rule to understand the choices others don't understand, and help reveal them in such a way which helps them learn the existence of choices they couldn't see before. Dark and Rawl can do this as well, as we will see in Chapter 19. And the magic of the underworld is represented as the destruction of a person who has their own lack of understanding about the choices they really have led them to destroy their own ability to think rationally. So if someone abuses this knowledge on another person, they can actually make them less rational. That's what 80 is talking about here. That's the danger that is represented by Kahlan using one to back the other. 80 takes a minute to give Kahlan a warning about the true power she has inside her. She calls it the true power of the tongue and tells her it will be a terrible thing if she ever lets it out. Kahlan doesn't know what that means, and 80 knows that's the truth. She mentions that Kahlan's mother is supposed to teach her about it, but wasn't able to do so before she died. But that doesn't mean she can't bring it out just because she doesn't know how. Kahlan didn't know her mother that well and asks Adie if she could tell her anything about her. She also mentions being able to see the same green in her eyes that was in her mother's. We also find out that Adie gave Kahlan's mom a bone necklace to protect her unborn baby. Adie is referencing the Kandar, where all of the limitations of her confessor's power are lifted, and she becomes a single-minded weapon of terrible destructive power. I'll save that symbolism for when we get to it later in the novel. But I will take a moment to talk about why Kahlan has green eyes. Remember back to chapter 14 with all of the ways the edge of the boundary represents things that try to convince us to use our free will to act like we don't have any choice about something other than how we feel about it at the time. It's important to notice that those things are not the boundary itself. They're next to it. The same as Adie lives next to the boundary as well. Some of the things have the ability to pull us into the boundary, like when a person like Dark and Rawl turns our fear or sense of justice against itself. Justice has green eyes because it lives right near the boundary. When the truth is behind it, it remains intact. When words become the creator of truth, then it passes through the boundary and is destroyed. Additionally, the color green is specifically commonly associated with envy. And before you jump into the comments about how Kahlan isn't a green-eyed envy monster, just hear me out, because it's not as bad as it sounds. In fact, it's just the way justice needs to be if it's going to be strong enough to stand when the truth is behind it. Envy is an emotion which occurs when a person lacks another's superior quality, achievement, or possession, and either desires it or wishes that the other lacked it. That is what envy it is. Someone has something better than what you have. You either want it for yourself or wish they didn't have it. Envy comes before justice. When a person witnesses justice in one place and injustice in another, envy is the appropriate response. Wanting to have justice is not a bad thing. And notice how the definition of envy has a warning built into it as well. There are two separate paths. There is a desire for what the other person has, or a wish that the other person didn't have it at all. Not having justice and wanting it is a good thing. Not having justice and not wanting anyone else to have justice as a result is not where the rational mind lives. That place is so blinded by pain that there is no humanity left. They wouldn't even be able to recognize true justice if they saw it at that point, even if they wanted to. Kahlan's green eyes represent envy for justice as the thing which makes justice go. It is up to the person to decide where it goes from there. Richard interrupts Kahlan's emotionally fulfilling journey into her family history as Adie shares a piece of her backstory and makes an impassioned plea for help from her. Notice how he doesn't demand, he doesn't guilt, doesn't lie or pressure her into saying yes. He does the exact same thing he did with Zed when he asked him for help stopping Dark and Rawl. He tells the truth and gives them the choice. Adie says she's already decided to help them and is already doing it. But Richard says, my wizard friend is getting worse, and Adie says to him, how the heck do you know what his wizard friend is doing anyways? The author uses the term strained tolerance. Symbolically, she is doing her best at this moment to keep her own honesty with the self in check. She is telling herself that Richard doesn't recognize all of the choices he has and the ability to make right now, and he is chasing down the only path he knows how. It's a path forged from a desire to do good, but it is also one of incomplete information. She keeps this in mind and asks a few questions to try and get Richard's mind back to where it belongs. She asks if Richard knows Kahlan's secret, if Kahlan knows Richard's secret, if Zed knows Richard's secret, if Richard knows Zed's secret, and then she calls them all blind and says she can see better than any of them. Symbolically, this tracks. Adie is the symbol for honesty. She is the eyes which see that which is true and that which is not. Integrity can be destroyed. Justice and pride can be hijacked. Self-reliance can be abused. But honesty either is or is not. The only thing which is destroyed when it isn't honest is honesty itself. Richard asks whose secret she actually knows, and she says just Kahlan's. And Richard is relieved because he's holding on to his secret very tightly. He's on the verge of panic when he thinks Adie might know it. When Adie is finished asking about secrets, she asks Richard if he knows how to heal his friends. Her point being, if he has no idea what is wrong with them and has no ability to heal them, then how can he know what must or must not be done to help them? Adie says by being inside her house, that is helping them to heal, and she will make sure they eat and drink enough so they can be kept alive until they recover. She also says that while they're awake, being fed and watered, they won't recognize him until they're better. Adie says Richard put some bones on them and uses some magic to make them wake up. Each of them gets a half a bucket of water to drink before they go back to sleep. The symbolism here is advice on how to heal old wounds to the heart and the mind, and it's a powerful lesson. The bones in Adie's house are the symbols of things which cause damage to the mind. The pain, the hurt, the resentment, the depression, the anxiety, and the desperate need for validation. It will be covered later in more detail, but those bones have the ability to hide things from a person from those things. Very similar to the Mercewith capes in Blood of the Fold. It is a type of camouflage by blending in. You are not attacked because you're not noticed. When Adie says they must be kept alive by feeding and water them, all the symbology there is saying is that the path to healing is one where a person chooses to remove themselves from what is causing their pain, and especially choosing to remove themselves from the reason they think it is impossible to remove themselves from their own pain. Once that is achieved, then the wounds can be fed, watered, strengthened by honesty over time until a recovery is made. The way to understand this is ask yourself, if you have any personal rituals of relaxation that you follow to help you get through the stress of everyday life. For some, it's meditation. For others, it's martial arts. A long bath, quiet fishing trip, small fire, good book. All of these are examples of this. While we might not always realize the ways we can prevent the things which cause us pain, we are still smart enough to know that getting away from that pain when it is destructive, instead of feeding into it and making it worse, is a healthy course of action. It's treating the symptoms and sometimes not the problem, but the symptoms can be just as deadly as the disease if they're not taken seriously. The cause may be different and preventable, but the pain in that moment is no less real because of that fact. Adie answered Richard's call for help with a request for some home cooking. Something about those with a gift in food, am I right? Richard is happy to be able to do something he understands to help, while Adie does her job of helping her friends. He cuts up some vegetables and lets Kahlan and Adie have a chat on the floor. Richard is a skilled sous chef and has all of the vegetables prepared before the women are done talking, which is much better for me to say than the women take far too long to talk, because I would never hear the end of that from our current PC culture. So Richard's an exceptionally skilled chef, and the women chat for an appropriate amount of time. He asks if Adie would let him cut some firewood, and then she says, "Wouldn't that be lovely? Don't forget to take your shirt off. I'm blind, so there's nothing to worry about here. Ah-cha-cha-cha-cha." Then Richard goes outside and makes most of the women happy, and some of the men, not that there's anything wrong with that, happy by removing his shirt and doing his best interpretation of a rugged, self-sufficient mountain man. Shapen nature with his bare hands, with only the forest, the trees, and the tools in his hands, and the sun glinting off of his rippling six-pack abs, and shoulders that would put the Greek god Atlas to shame. He feels safe here, but he doesn't forget about the problems he's facing. That is what honesty feels like once a person gets close to it. Notice how much panic there was when Richard was worried Adie might know his secret. Symbolically, that tooth represents a deeply instilled lie that Richard believes, and that lie was given to him by the love of his father. Accepting that lie to be a lie would be painful, and Richard runs from that pain. Having honesty touch that moment is a scary thing for him. When Richard passes many of Adie's tests, he doesn't pass them all. He still isn't being honest with himself, which is why later in the chapter, Adie will mention telling him the story about how she lost her foot. She can see that Richard still needs to work on this and is giving him the best information she can about why it's important, hoping he will learn from her mistakes. Richard worries about his brother and wishes he would have had time to go there before he left. He feels his brother will be in great danger once the boundary failed. While he is doing this, Richard focuses on daydreaming about all the things he can imagine the wood to be while cutting it. He uses dark and raw, agar, and when he needs his strength the most, he thinks of the red-haired man. Richard is doing for himself physically what Adie is symbolically doing for Zed and Chase. He's removed himself from all of the other things which are weighing him down and causing the damage to his mind. He feels like he's in a place of peace, and he builds himself back up by using his hands to accomplish something good and productive for the benefit of another human being. He is nourishing the parts of him which were damaged by giving Adie the gratitude she has earned in his eyes. He is happy to help her, and that comes from her willingness to help them first without the promise of anything in return. Kahlan comes outside to peek at a shirtless, muscular Richard, using the excuse that it's time to eat. Having lost track of the time, he realizes that he's a sweaty mess, but the camera used to shoot him has one of those special lenses that add shadow and muscle definition, so it only makes him look even more appealing. And say what you want about the guy, Terry Goodkind isn't above giving some of his readers a little fan service every now and again, as Richard literally pulls a bucket of water out of a well, and with a slow motion rotating 360-degree angle shot, he proceeds to pour said water over himself. We know Kahlan didn't see it, she was inside, but Adie can use her gift to see through the walls, and she saw all of it. When Richard comes back inside, she says, and this is a direct quote, "Richard, you have given me a wonderful gift." Richard has no idea what she's talking about, and she tells him by letting her chat with Kahlan in her own native language, she's given her something of value. Wink. Adie reveals that learning about Dark and Raw taking the boundaries down explains a lot of things, and she tells Richard he has to decide if he's going to go on or if he's going to wait for his friends to recover. Richard worries that it's too much for one old woman to do alone, and Adie says that it's all well and good, but this old woman needs these two young people to go out and stop Dark and Raw. But it has to be their choice. Kahlan keeps quiet because this isn't her choice to make, and Adie asks Richard what is his choice. And again, it always comes back to choice, doesn't it? Are the choices which really matter, all the choices which really matter, always fall into the hands of integrity. That is where the buck stops, and that is why it always stops at Richard. He is the one to say what is right and what is not. No one is going to do that for him unless he asks them to, and that would be a poor choice on his part. That is why Adie will only tell him the truth, and Kahlan will follow him. Symbolically, that is saying our integrity is responsible for the quality of the choices we make. Richard says he doesn't know enough to put his faith in anyone but himself, but he decides to go on without them. Adie says he is brave and that he's probably going to feel a lot less brave when all this is over because the path he's chosen is difficult beyond his worst fears. Richard takes comfort in the fact that Kahlan is there with him to help complete the team he needs to win. This statement here jumped out to me as having a double meaning. On the surface, it's very accurate. The phrase, "beyond your worst fears," means a very scary thing. However, in this instance, Adie is being more honest than Richard or Kahlan realize. She is talking about that which lies ahead being difficult beyond his worst fears. On the other side of the boundary, the side where our rational mind cannot function because it's too angry or too scared, is quite literally a figurative representation of what is beyond the worst fears he can understand. They are beyond his worst fears because they are beyond the boundary. They're beyond the edge of his rational mind. Adie tells them to eat up and eat hearty because before bedtime, she's going to tell them the story of how she lost her foot. It's time for the official #1 quote from Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth in Chapter 16. Please note that the views and opinions of what the official #1 quote from this chapter is may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your #1 quote for this chapter is. In the event that your #1 quote is different from the one mentioned here, please list your candidate for the #1 quote in the comments below. And the official #1 quote is when Adie says to Kahlan, and to herself if I'm right about it, "I understand, child. Forgive me for thoughtlessly giving you cause for alarm." In our next episode, Adie tells the story about how she lost her foot and tells Richard and Kahlan what to expect in the past. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you feel like you found honesty, strength, and connection in this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you found something that helped you, I ask that you share a link with this video to those you wish to find what you have found. Give them a timestamp for it. It's an hour long, right? Sometimes more. Give them a timestamp and give them the 1 or 2 minutes you think would help. If those feelings are not there yet, I invite you to come back for the next episode and give me a chance to try and change your Fjord. Thank you for watching. My name is Tom, and I've been your guide. Thank you, and this has been Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. Come and join me next time, so while I am seeking these truths, you can become seekers of that truth as well. Thank you. I hope to see you again.